My name is Keith Folse, and I'm going to talk about how I would use the workbook that goes with Keys to Teaching Grammar to English Language Learners. At the university where I teach, there is a graduate level grammar course, and in that graduate level grammar course, I require students to buy 3 books. They use the textbook, which is Keys to Teaching Grammar to English Language Learners, published by the University of Michigan Press. They also use the workbook that goes with that. And then they also use this book, which is Clear Grammar Book 1, which is a student textbook. I'll first just let me mention how these 3 work out together. You have the Red Keys book, which is the information about everything you wanted to know or didn't want to know about present progressive. It's all there. There's a workbook that goes with the textbook, page by page, exercise by exercise. And then I also require them to use the student book, which is actually looking at the ESL grammar from the student's point of view. All right? Well, the workbook, in my class at least, this is how I use the workbook. What I don't do is go over every single exercise in class. I do assign a ton of exercises. So for example, the homework for next week might be to do one of the 15, probably not one, 2 of the keys in chapter 3 in the actual textbook. So for example, it might be to do key 1, which is the verb to be, and it might be to do key 2, which is all of the different verb tenses that are used to express present time. That could be present, simple present, present progressive, present perfect is possible, present perfect progressive even. All right, so I assign key 1 and key 2. And also as a note, I would almost never assign 2 verb things for the same meeting. So it might be key 1 and pick another one. I don't know, say the key that deals with count and non-count nouns. So 2 things that are very different there. In the workbook for key 1, I'm just guessing here, but I'll bet that there are about maybe 6 or 7 pages of detailed questions that accompany that particular key on the use of the verb to be, am, is, are, and what all be can do in the English language. And then for count and non-count nouns, you probably have the same situation set up as well. If you're working back and not in chapter 3, if you're in chapter 2, which is the nuts and bolts of English, where we cover the basic parts of speech, and we also cover the 12 verb tenses, etc. When we cover the 12 verb tenses, we cover that in about 15 minutes in class, the overview. Again, I have native speakers, and what they're supposed to do is be able to look at a sentence, pick out the verb immediately, and identify the verb. And in fact, in that class, I often begin by saying, what color is this book? And they say green in what, 0.5 of a second, and I tell them that's the exact same way you need to be able to identify verb tenses. You can't do that unless you practice doing that. And that's what the workbook does. I know some of my fellow professors who teach this class might view the workbook as tedious, and your students may even complain about it. Let them complain. Seriously. I get complaints indirectly from students about the book, but my job is to make sure that my students, when they leave our TSL 6350, that they truly know English grammar inside and out. And anyone who gets an A in my class, really, they know grammar inside and out. They're able to complete these kind of activities, such as identifying verbs and their verb tenses quickly in a time situation. I know that I'm producing teachers who will not have problems with the basic nuts and bolts of the English language. Okay? So the way I run this in classes, I go to class, and suppose we've had the equivalent of, I don't know, 15 pages of homework in the workbook. What I don't do is ask students to open their workbook to page 22, 23, 24. I'll set aside 15 or 20 minutes, and I'll say, now we have time for any and all questions you have about the exercises. Because the workbook for the Keys book actually has all the answers in the back of the book, the students are able, and it's their responsibility to do the work, check their answers, and when their answers disagree with what the key says, those are exactly the kinds of things they need to think about before class as graduate students, and or bring to our attention in class. Because I always tell students, if you have a question about something, the odds are that other students also have a question about it. They just might feel reluctant or shy to ask. The time to ask these questions and to develop the skills and being not a good but a great grammar teacher is now. That's the whole purpose of the class. So for me, I try to run this the way my math teacher used to run things in high school, which is just at the beginning of class, I'll ask, okay, you had the homework, what questions do you have? I'll write those problems on the board, number 7 on page 22, page 23, number 5 and 6, page 28, etc. And once we have those numbers up on the board, we probably have 4 or 5 questions up there at least. And for the next 15 or 20 minutes, I will talk about those questions, and I will try to, instead of just saying, well, the answer is X because, I will try to do an inductive approach with my own graduate students and try to get them to understand why that question that they're having is a good question and how it might impact their students. This can't possibly happen if the students aren't doing something that you might view as tedious as what's in this workbook. One final comment, I've had people say, this is a graduate level class, and in graduate level classes I don't believe in doing workbook exercises. Well, I understand where you're coming from, but the grammar class that we teach is not a theoretical grammar class. It's the nuts and bolts of English, followed by the true nuts and bolts of ESL grammar, and our students are expected to be able to answer and teach and deal with questions related to the 15 key areas identified in the textbook for grammar for English language learners.